smelled like sea air and polished entitlement. A glass table stretched toward the windows, the kind of table that makes you whisper without meaning to. At the head sat William Dawson Sr., watching me like I'd wandered in off the highway. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was just family until tonight proved what family really means. Laura and I met before any of this mattered. Before family names carried weight. Before dinner tables felt like courtrooms. Before I learned what it's like to be judged without being questioned. We were young, not dramatic. Young. Just early. Early jobs. Early dreams. Early mistakes we thought love could fix. She wasn't impressed by ambition. She paid attention to how people treated waiters, how they spoke when no one important was listening. That should have told me everything. When I first met her family, nothing went wrong. That was the problem. No arguments, no raised voices, just a quiet kind of distance that didn't have to explain itself. They smiled. They shook my hand. They asked polite questions and listened just long enough to respond with something safe. Then they stopped asking. When we decided to get married, the reaction didn't come as a fight. It came as an absence. No objections. No ultimatums. Just no one showing up. A small ceremony. A few friends. Laura's side of the aisle noticeably lighter. Her father didn't call to yell. He didn't call at all. That silence said more than anger ever could. It wasn't that he thought Laura was making a mistake. It was that, to him, the mistake had already happened. She'd chosen someone outside the frame he understood. I became the husband in conversations I wasn't part of. Never my name, never my work. Just a label that explained everything he needed it to explain. At holidays, I was present but never included. I was handed a plate but not a question. Given a seat but not a voice. You learn quickly what kind of place you have when people don't need to say it out loud. Laura noticed. Of course, she always did. But she didn't confront them. Not because she agreed, but because she believed, for a long time, that patience would soften things. That if we just lived well, worked hard, stayed kind, eventually, they'd see us as equals. I let her believe that. Because the truth is, I didn't want to be the reason she had to choose sides. I didn't want to be the crack that split her from her family. So I learned how to shrink myself in rooms that weren't built for me. I answered questions briefly. I laughed when the joke wasn't funny. I thanked people for courtesy that felt more like permission. And every time we left, Laura would squeeze my hand in the car, not to apologize, just to remind me she saw it too. That quiet squeeze became our language. Years passed. Careers changed. Lives filled in around us. But the label never did. I was still the outsider. Still the man who married in. Still the one whose presence needed explaining. And here's the thing most people don't understand about silent rejection. You don't get angry right away. First, you try harder, then you try less. Then you stop trying altogether. You learn to exist without expecting recognition. You convince yourself that love doesn't require approval. That respect will come eventually. And maybe it would have if no one had ever been hurt by the waiting. But that comes later. At the beginning, all you know is this. You can be welcomed into a family without ever being accepted by it. And that kind of distance doesn't push you out. It slowly teaches you where not to stand. William never had to raise his voice to remind you who mattered. He used furniture for that. At his house, the table wasn't just a table. It was a map. The head faced the water. That seat was his. Closest to him sat the people whose opinions counted. Those who spoke first. Those who were asked what they thought. The rest of us filled in where space allowed. I learned early not to sit until I was told. And I was almost never told. When conversations started, they didn't move in circles. They moved in lines. William spoke, then Nathan, then whichever relative was closest in blood and furthest from doubt. Ideas flowed one way. Agreement flowed back. If a decision was being shaped, I wasn't asked to help shape it. I was there to hear the shape it had already taken. Sometimes I tried to contribute. Nothing bold, nothing disruptive. Just a comment, an observation. William would nod once. Not an agreement. In acknowledgement. Then he'd turn his body just slightly toward someone else. The conversation would continue without me. That's how you learn the difference between being present and being included. At first, I thought it was personal, that maybe I hadn't earned the right to speak yet, so I paid attention. I noticed patterns. Who was asked for an opinion before dessert, who was interrupted, who was allowed to finish a sentence even when it ran long. It wasn't about intelligence. I'd heard Nathan say things that wouldn't survive a meeting outside that house. It wasn't about experience either. Some relatives had never built anything on their own. It was about belonging to a category that didn't require proof. Blood. Legacy. A last name that came with an assumption of competence. William didn't see himself as unfair. He saw himself as practical. To him, the world made sense in tears, and tears needed order. The problem with that kind of thinking is that it doesn't announce itself as prejudice. It presents itself as tradition. No one ever said, "You're not good enough to speak." They just never asked. No one said, "Your work doesn't matter." They just changed the subject when you mentioned it. That's how class bias works inside families. Quietly. Routinely. Without needing to defend itself, it lives in rituals. Who pours the wine? Who carves the meat? Who gets introduced to guests by name? And who gets described by role? He's Laura's husband. Not Ethan. Not what I did. Just where I fit. And once you're placed in a role like that, people stop checking the facts. They don't ask questions that might complicate the picture. They don't look at data that could contradict their belief. Because curiosity is dangerous when your identity depends on being above someone else. William never wondered if I had insight worth hearing. Because in his mind, that would mean revisiting a decision he'd already made. And people like him don't revisit. They reinforce. They surround themselves with agreement and call it consensus. I saw this play out again and again. At birthdays. At holidays. At family discussions that were really announcements. I was always informed. Never consulted. Always close enough to hear the plan. Never close enough to shape it. Laura noticed too. Sometimes she'd try to pull me in. She'd ask me directly what I thought. William would let me answer. He was polite like that. But the moment I finished, he'd reframe it in his own words. Or ask someone else for confirmation. As if my opinion needed translation to become legitimate. That wasn't cruelty. It was habit. And habits are harder to confront than insults. Because insults give you something to fight. Habits make you feel foolish for noticing. Here's the truth most people don't want to hear. People who are underestimated rarely lose because they lack ability. They lose because someone else decided, early on, not to see it. Once that decision is made, evidence stops mattering. Achievements get reclassified as luck. Silence gets mistaken for weakness. Restraint gets read as absence. William believed he understood me completely. That belief was his blind spot. And blind spots are dangerous not because they're empty, but because people trust them. So I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because saying it wouldn't have changed the frame. You don't argue your way out of a label. You outgrow it somewhere else. And you wait. Because when someone builds their authority on an assumption, the most effective response isn't to challenge it out loud. It's to let that assumption stand, right up until it collapses under its own weight. Maya didn't grow up around boardrooms. She grew up around grocery lists, homework spread across the kitchen table, hand-me-down jackets that still had someone else's name stitched inside. Laura and I kept things simple because that's what made sense to us. Not because we were trying to prove something. Not because we were pretending. We just didn't need much to feel like a family. Maya was the kind of kid who noticed things. Not the loud things. The quiet things. She noticed when Laura came home tired and still cooked anyway. She noticed when I fixed the leaky sink instead of calling a guy. She noticed who showed up when it mattered and who didn't. By the time she was a teenager, she had this habit. If she saw someone being ignored, she'd move toward them. That carried into adulthood. Maya studied the kind of work most people don't brag about. Community outreach, housing support, the systems that keep people from falling through the cracks. She wasn't interested in titles. She wanted results. Her apartment was small. 1 bedroom. Thin walls, a view of a parking lot and a laundry room that smelled like bleach. She drove an older car with a dent in the rear bumper and a trunk full of supplies. Blankets, water bottles, packets of socks she bought in bulk because she learned fast what people actually need. Her phone rang at inconvenient times, late at night, early mornings, weekends, and she answered it. When people ask me what kind of person my daughter is, I don't talk about her resume. I talk about that. The fact that she answers. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. Because if you say, "My daughter lives modestly," people nod. They respect it. But if you say, "My daughter lives modestly while I have more money than she could spend in 5 lifetimes," people stop nodding. They start judging. And I understand why. You hear that, and you think one of 2 things. Either the father is selfish, or the father is controlling. And sometimes, if you're being honest, you think both. So let me be clear. Maya wasn't struggling because I wanted her to struggle. She struggled because she chose a road that pays in meaning, not in salary. And I didn't want to buy her out of that choice. I could have put her in a condo with a view. I could have made 1 phone call and had her working at a respectable office downtown. I could have turned her life into something that looked impressive at a dinner party. But the version of Maya that mattered to me, the one Laura and I raised, would have shrunk in that world. Because when everything is handed to you, even the good things start to feel like obligations. And Maya hated obligations. She wanted her work to be hers, her wins to be hers, her life to be hers. But there's a difference between respecting your child's independence and letting them carry weight they shouldn't have to carry. That's the line people don't talk about. We confuse self-reliant with unsupported. We confuse building character with making it harder than it needs to be. There were nights I looked at her worn-out shoes by the door and felt something tighten in my chest. Not guilt, responsibility. Because a parent's job isn't to remove every struggle. It's to make sure the struggle isn't pointless. So I did what I've always done. I built quiet safety, not flashy help. Not the kind that changes who she is, the kind that keeps her from breaking over something stupid. A medical bill, a car repair, a sudden rent increase that could push her out of the neighborhood she served. I made sure there was always a net underneath her. She didn't have to know the net existed to benefit from it. And yes, I know how that sounds. I can hear the argument already. If you love your kid, you tell them. You don't hide it. You don't decide for them. You're not wrong. But here's what I was afraid of. I was afraid that if Maya knew exactly how much money was in our world, people like William would start treating her differently. Not better. Differently. They'd try to recruit her, label her, use her as proof that their version of success works. And Maya would spend her life defending her motives instead of doing her work. Because in certain circles, the moment money touches your story, everything gets questioned. Even your kindness. William certainly questioned it. He saw Maya and didn't see compassion. He saw failure. He saw a granddaughter who should have been leveraged. A young woman who could have worn the family name like armor and climbed into the company like it was her birthright. Every time he asked about her, it wasn't, "How is she?" It was, "What is she doing with her life?" Like her life was a resume for his approval. And when the answer didn't impress him, his disappointment wasn't quiet. It was strategic. He used it to reinforce the narrative he already believed. That Laura had married down. That Maya was proof. That the cold blood didn't build things. It just took up space. Maya never heard most of what he said. Laura did. I did. And we kept going. Because we were proud of her. Not because she fit into their world. Because she refused to. And that refusal, quiet, stubborn, consistent, was the very thing that made William look at our family and see something he couldn't tolerate. A kind of success he couldn't measure. The dinner was called as a courtesy. That's how William framed it. Not a meeting, not an announcement, just a family gathering to talk about the future. The table was set before we arrived. Name cards, assigned seats, everything decided in advance. Laura and I were placed together, halfway down the table, close enough to hear, far enough to remind us we weren't central. Maya wasn't there yet. William didn't ask where she was. He waited until the plates were cleared and the room had settled into that polite, quiet people mistake for respect. Then he stood. No toast. No build-up. He spoke the way men do when they believe their authority is self-evident. He talked about legacy, stability, protecting what we've built. Nathan sat straighter the moment his name came up. William announced the transition like it was already done. Nathan would assume operational leadership. 2 cousins would oversee key divisions. Advisors handpicked. Oversight streamlined. No votes mentioned. No questions invited. He paused long enough for agreement to fill the room. Then he turned to Laura. Her name was said gently, almost kindly. She would receive a symbolic stake. Enough to feel included. Not enough to influence anything. William called it security. I watched Laura's hand tighten around her fork. She didn't look up. Next came Maya. Or rather, what came was the absence of her. William mentioned her briefly. As an afterthought. A fixed amount. A clean cutoff. No role. No expectation. He said it like he was sparing her. Protecting her from a world she clearly doesn't want. The room nodded. No one asked if that was true. Then William looked at me. It was the first time that night he did. He cleared his throat and offered me a job. Not a partnership. Not a seat. A position. Facilities coordination. Asset oversight. A role that sounded important until you realized it wasn't. He framed it as generosity. A way to bring me into the fold. A chance to finally contribute. I didn't answer right away. Neither did anyone else. Even Nathan shifted in his chair, because everyone at that table understood what was happening. This wasn't inclusion. It was containment. A way to keep me visible, but powerless. Busy, but irrelevant. Close enough to watch decisions being made. Far enough to never affect them. William smiled when he finished, like he'd just resolved a problem. Laura finally looked up. She didn't argue. She didn't interrupt. She just asked one question. Is that all? William tilted his head. As I said, he replied, it's generous. That's when I understood something. The most infuriating form of unfairness isn't cruelty. It's when injustice is packaged as kindness, when exclusion is presented as protection, when limitation is framed as concern, when control calls itself care. I thought of all the years Laura had spent trying to earn approval that was never coming. I thought of Maya, answering late-night calls from people who had nothing, while being quietly written out of a future she never asked for. And I thought of how calmly William spoke, because in his mind, this wasn't a power grab. It was order being restored. I declined the offer, not dramatically, not angrily, just a simple refusal. William blinked. He hadn't expected that. He reminded me of the benefits, the stability, the opportunity. I thanked him and said, "No again." The room tightened. Nathan spoke next, trying to smooth things over, explaining how roles evolve, how respect is earned over time. I listened and said nothing, because the truth was, the moment William stood up, the lines were already drawn, the hierarchy made visible, the judgments finalized. Laura had been minimized. Maya had been dismissed. And I'd been offered a place that confirmed everything William believed about me. A place beneath him. I didn't challenge him. Not yet. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't defend my worth. I let the silence do its work, because some announcements aren't meant to be argued. They're meant to reveal who people think you are. And that night, William said everything out loud, not with insults, not with threats, but with a plan that assumed I would accept being small. That assumed Laura would be grateful for crumbs. That assumed Maya's life didn't count because it didn't look impressive from the outside. That assumption was the mistake, not because it offended me, but because it was wrong. And wrong assumptions don't stay wrong quietly forever. They wait, just like I had. After William offered me that job, the room waited for my reaction. Not because they cared what I wanted, because they wanted to see how small I would agree to be. Nathan watched me like a man watching a lock, checking if it's going to hold. Laura didn't look at anyone. She stared at the water in her glass. Maya still wasn't back, and I said nothing. I let the silence stretch. That silence wasn't confusion. It was restraint, because I could feel what the audience would feel in that moment. If you were watching this from the outside, you might be thinking, okay, so he's stuck, he's outnumbered, he's embarrassed. You might even be thinking, why doesn't he just say something? That's the trap. People like William love arguments, because arguments happen on their turf, at their table, under their rules, with their witnesses. And in those rooms, the person who gets emotional loses twice. First, they lose the moment. Then they lose the story of the moment. So I didn't fight him there. I watched William's confidence, the way he spoke as if decisions were natural laws. I watched Nathan's relief, the moment his inheritance stopped feeling theoretical. And I watched the cousins nodding along, because nodding is what you do when you're being handed power you didn't earn. Then I asked myself one question. Not, how do I prove my worth? Not, how do I win this conversation? Just one question. Where is power actually decided? Because it isn't decided at a dinner table. A dinner table is for performance. Power is decided in documents, in votes, in contracts, in obligations people can't walk away from without consequences. That's the part most people don't see. They think ownership is a name printed on a brochure. They think influence is a loud voice. In the real world, ownership can sit behind a holding company, a neutral name, a separate entity, a structure built for privacy, sometimes for protection, sometimes for strategy. And the reason that works is simple. Most people never look beyond what they want to believe. William didn't see me as a man with leverage, so he never checked for leverage. He never wondered who was backing the deals he bragged about. He never asked who kept the lights on when things got tight, because asking those questions would mean admitting he needed someone, and William didn't do need. Years earlier, when the company hit a rough stretch, they didn't announce it at family dinners. They handled it quietly. A project delayed, a credit line tightened. One bad quarter turns into two. That's when banks get cautious. And cautious banks don't care about pride. They care about guarantees. William came out of that period smiling. He told everyone the company had navigated market conditions. He took credit for stability. What he didn't share was what stability required. A guarantee, a backstop, a signature that turns maybe into approved. And that's where my name lived. Not at the dinner table, on paper. Through a structure most people would never connect to me. A holding company, a set of legal instruments, an obligation the company relied on without talking about it. Because when you're the kind of man who values image, you don't like admitting you needed help. You rename help into something respectable. Financing, strategic partnerships, liquidity solutions, words that sound like strength. Now, there's an important thing to understand here. Large control doesn't just appear overnight. It's built in steps, quiet steps, a percentage here, an agreement there, a guarantee that comes with conditions, a seat you don't take publicly, but still exists when votes are counted. And yes, there are rules around this kind of power. There are reporting thresholds, disclosure requirements, governance procedures. That's why timing matters. Because if you reveal the structure too early, you turn your life into noise, lawyers, attention, people who suddenly want to reconnect. And worst of all, you poison the one thing Laura and I tried to keep clean: our family. William never wanted to know who was behind the curtain, because behind the curtain is where his pride gets uncomfortable. He liked the story where he was the builder, the patriarch, the man who didn't owe anyone anything. So he didn't check, he didn't ask, he didn't look at the parts of the system that didn't flatter him. That night, while he was offering me a job like it was charity, I wasn't thinking about insult. I was thinking about mechanism, about leverage that doesn't argue, leverage that doesn't beg, leverage that simply exists. I reached into my pocket and felt my phone. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. I wasn't going to turn this into a spectacle. I wasn't going to win by embarrassing him in his own house. I was going to win where his decisions actually had to stand. In the place William couldn't control with seating arrangements. In the place where votes are counted the same no matter who you are. And that was the moment the story shifted. Not because I got angry, because I stopped playing his game and started preparing to end it. That night ended the way William wanted it to end, with him standing tall, with everyone else quietly absorbing the shape of his plan. We left without a scene. Laura thanked Patricia out of habit. I held the door for the cousins. Nathan gave me a tight smile like we'd just settled something. Outside, the air was cold and salty. The driveway lights made the cars look like display items. Laura didn't speak until we were halfway down the hill. Then she said, very softly, "He didn't even look at Maya's life like it was real." I kept my eyes on the road, because if I answered with emotion, I'd do what William wanted. I'd make it about my pride. But it wasn't my pride that got cut that night. It was my wife's value, my daughter's dignity. So I drove, and I listened to the sound the tires made on wet pavement. Back home, nothing looked different. The same worn entry rug, the same dish towel hanging crooked on the oven handle. And that's the part people don't understand. When the world treats you like you're invisible long enough, You stop trying to be seen. You start building quietly instead. That night, after Laura went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, not shaking, not rushing, just deciding what to do next. Because leverage isn't useful unless you're willing to use it. And I had never wanted to use mine against family. But William made it clear he wasn't treating us like family. He was managing us like liabilities. So I opened a folder I hadn't touched in a long time. A clean digital dashboard, a few documents, a list of agreements with signatures that weren't mine, but existed because of me. Here's the thing. When you hear ownership, you picture someone sitting in a corner office. You picture a name on a plaque. Real ownership doesn't look like that. Real ownership looks like a structure, a holding entity that doesn't show up at weddings, a legal position that doesn't need to make small talk. For years, my involvement with Dawson's infrastructure group had been silent, not hidden in a criminal way, hidden in a boring way. A company name that meant nothing to the average person. A set of instruments that most people don't read because reading them would ruin the story they tell themselves. I didn't buy influence all at once. I accumulated it. Slowly. A minority stake at first. Then a larger one. Then, when the company hit that rough stretch years back, I did something else. I guaranteed a loan. Not out of charity. Out of necessity. Because the group had contracts in motion, major logistics projects, energy corridors, long-term builds. If they lost financing midstream, it wouldn't just embarrass William, it would collapse the entire operation. Jobs, supply chains, penalties that would ripple outward. So my firm provided what the banks demanded, a backstop, a guarantee tied to conditions. A condition that mattered. If governance became reckless, the guarantee could be reviewed. If key decisions endangered solvency, independent oversight could be triggered. There was language for it, formal language, the kind that doesn't care who your father is. William forgot that language existed because he never thought of the company as something that could be questioned. He thought of it as something he owned by birthright. But birthright doesn't pay debt. So at 1:12, I sent one email, not to William, not to Nathan, to the corporate secretary and the board's outside counsel. Subject line simple: request for special board session. Trigger of governance review clause. Notice of guarantor action. I attached the documents, everything clean. Everything signed. Everything already valid before that dinner even started. Then I set my phone face down on the table, and I went to bed. The next morning, William called before sunrise. I didn't answer on the first ring, not to punish him, to let him sit with the feeling for a second, the feeling I'd lived with for years. When I picked up, he didn't greet me. He didn't ask how I was. He said my name like it was an accusation. What did you do? I sat at the edge of the bed so Laura wouldn't wake. I filed notice. I said, exactly the way the agreements require. There was a pause. The kind of pause you hear when someone is reading a reality they didn't know existed. That's not your place, he said. I kept my voice even. It became my place the day my guarantee kept your company alive. Another pause. Longer this time. Then I heard something I'd never heard from William. Uncertainty. Because uncertainty is what happens when the story you've been living in gets replaced by paperwork. The board meeting was scheduled for 10. Not at his house. Not around his table. In a conference room with neutral walls and a clock that didn't care about anyone's last name. William walked in like he always did. Chin up, shoulders square. Nathan followed, still confident, still assuming the room belonged to them. Until the screen lit up. A clean presentation. ownership blocks, voting thresholds, governance triggers, and one line, sitting there like a weight. Guarantor Coal Holdings. My name wasn't in neon. It didn't need to be. William stared at it the way a man stares at a crack in a foundation. Not loud, not dramatic, just long enough for the room to go quiet. Nathan leaned forward, trying to interpret it as something smaller, a clerical thing, a misunderstanding. But the council didn't flinch. She explained it once. Then she explained the consequence. If the board ignored the governance review, the guarantee could be withdrawn. And without that guarantee, refinancing would fail. Contracts would trigger defaults. The company would bleed out in public. That's when William finally looked at me. Not the look from the dinner table. Not contempt. Not dismissal. A different look. The look of a man realizing he's been standing on someone else's support without knowing it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list every insult he'd ever made. I didn't even talk about the job offer. I said one sentence. Last night you presented unfairness as generosity. I let it sit. Then I added the second. Today we corrected in the only place that matters. No shouting. No revenge speech. Just a shift. A clean transfer of control from ego to mechanism. Because the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs the right room. That night, after everything settled, after the calls stopped coming in, after the house went quiet, Laura stood in the kitchen longer than she needed to. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. She was still. The kind of stillness that fills a room without making a sound. I was wiping down the counter out of habit. Same motion I'd done 1,000 times. Same place where we used to help Maya with homework. Where we argued about paint colors. Where life stayed small on purpose. Laura didn't look at me right away. She picked up her mug, set it down, moved it an inch to the left. Then she said, quietly. How long I didn't ask what she meant. Long enough. I said, that was my mistake. She finally looked at me then. Not sharply, not accusingly, just straight on. Long enough for what she asked. For me to get used to apologizing for things that weren't my fault. For Maya to learn how to live smaller than she needed to. Or long enough for you to decide this was my life. 2, I stopped wiping the counter. The room felt different when she said that. Not louder, heavier. I never decided for you. I said. She nodded once. Slow, controlled. And that's the problem. She replied. You decided without me. She turned away and stared out the window, at nothing in particular. I defended you for years. She continued. I told myself it didn't matter what my father thought. I told myself we were fine, that we had enough, and most days, we did. She paused. But there were nights, she said, when I wondered if I had made things harder for you. For Maya, if choosing love meant choosing less. I didn't interrupt. I made peace with that. She went on, because it was our choice. Together, her voice tightened just slightly. But tonight, I realized I've been living inside a version of our life where some doors were locked, and I didn't even know they existed. I sat down across from her, not to explain, to listen. She looked at me again. Was I ever going to get a say, she asked? Or were you planning to protect me forever by keeping me out of it? I took a breath. Not to calm myself. To be accurate, I was afraid, I said. Afraid that if money entered the room, it would sit between us. That it would change how you saw me, how we spoke, how decisions got made. She didn't argue. She didn't reassure me. She said, so instead, you let silence do that. That landed harder than anything her father had ever said to me. I thought I was shielding you, I said, from expectations, from people who only see numbers. She shook her head, just a little. You don't shield someone you love by taking away their right to choose, she said. Even if your intentions are good. We sat there. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. Then she said something that surprised me. I'm not angry that you have money. I nodded. I'm angry that you didn't trust me with the truth. That was it. Not the billions. Not the power. Trust. I needed to know, she said, that when my father looked down on you, and by extension on me and our daughter, you weren't just enduring it alone. She swallowed. I needed to know that we were carrying it together. I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. I should have told you, I said. Not because of the money, because of the weight. You were carrying it without knowing why. She watched my face carefully. So what happens now, she asked. Now, I said. There are no locked doors, no quiet decisions, no protection that costs you your voice. She exhaled slowly. I don't need to live large, she said. You know that. I just need to live honestly. I nodded. I'm sorry, I said. Not for what I built, but for how long I hid it from you. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet, not broken, just tired. This doesn't disappear overnight, she said. I know, but I'm still here. That mattered, not because it was forgiveness, because it was choice. And this time, it was hers. The changes didn't happen all at once. They never do. There was no dramatic announcement, no press release, no victory lap, just a sequence of meetings that started earlier than usual and ended later than anyone liked. An independent audit came first, not as punishment, as correction, the kind that doesn't ask who you are related to, only what you signed, what you approved, what you ignored. People always assume power is loud. It isn't. Real power shows up as an agenda item. Nathan stopped leading meetings after the second week, not because anyone humiliated him, because questions kept landing on his desk that he couldn't answer. Timelines he hadn't reviewed. Budgets he hadn't tracked. Decisions that looked good on paper, but collapsed under scrutiny. So the board adjusted. Not emotionally, mechanically. Responsibilities were reassigned. Oversight committees expanded. Roles went to people who knew how to carry them. Some of them had never spoken in the old meetings. Now they were asked first. William attended fewer sessions. When he did show up, he listened more than he talked. That shift alone told me everything. Because when someone stops speaking, it's rarely because they've changed their mind. It's because they've realized the room no longer moves when they do. Laura asked me once, late at night, whether any of this felt like revenge. I thought about it. No, I said. Revenge would have felt good for 5 minutes. This feels quiet. She nodded. Quiet was the point. Anger burns fast. It's hot, it's satisfying, and it leaves nothing useful behind. I've seen people burn entire futures just to prove they were right in a moment. They win the argument. They lose the ground. What I learned, what I wish someone had told me years earlier, is this. If you answer injustice with rage, you stay trapped inside it. If you answer it with structure, you change the outcome without changing who you are. That's the difference between shouting and repositioning, between proving a point and fixing a system. When people talk about standing up for yourself, they imagine confrontation, raised voices, sharp words, a final sentence that silences the room. That kind of moment feels powerful, but it rarely lasts. Because systems don't respond to emotion. They respond to process. To rules that don't bend for charisma. To agreements that don't care who's offended. I didn't win against William. I didn't defeat Nathan. I removed the conditions that allowed them to mistake control for competence. And that matters. Because when you fight people, you become part of the cycle. When you change the structure, the cycle ends without needing another villain. There were days I wanted to say more, to list the slights, to remind people how long Laura had been minimized, how often Maya had been dismissed without even being present. But those words would have served me. Not them, not the company, not the future. So I let the process speak. Let the minutes record what needed to be recorded. Let the votes land where they landed. Let the truth show up as math, not accusation. And something interesting happened. People started behaving differently. Not because they were afraid, because clarity has a way of disciplining ego. When roles are earned, not inherited, people prepare. When decisions are reviewed, not rubber-stamped, people think twice. That's how culture changes. Not with speeches, with consequences that don't raise their voice. One afternoon, weeks later, I ran into Nathan in the hallway. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just less certain. He nodded. I nodded back. Nothing needed to be said. That, too, was the point. If I had exploded that night at the dinner table, this would have turned into a story about bitterness, about pride, about a man who couldn't let go. Instead, it became something else. A correction, a reset, a reminder that power doesn't have to look like dominance to be effective. It just has to be legitimate. Because when your authority comes from process, not personality, it outlives emotion. And when justice is handled inside the rules, it doesn't leave scars behind, only alignment. That's how you win without becoming the thing you were standing against. Not by taking the throne, by making sure the throne no longer matters. A few weeks later, life looked familiar again. The same mornings, the same kitchen light coming on before sunrise, the same sound of the coffee maker clicking into place. Laura still took her mug to the window. Maya still left her shoes by the door like she always had. Nothing about our house changed. And that was intentional. Money didn't disappear. It just stopped trying to sit at the head of the table. The company stabilized. The board moved on. William stepped back without ceremony. No apology tour. No public reckoning. Just distance. And sometimes, distance is the cleanest boundary there is. Maya never asked for details. She didn't want them. What she noticed was simpler. That her mother stopped carrying herself like someone waiting to be corrected. That her father no longer went quiet when her last name came up in certain rooms. That mattered more than any inheritance ever could. One evening, she came home late, dropped her bag, and said, "Work was hard today." Laura nodded and said, "Do you want dinner?" That was it. No speeches about legacy. No lessons wrapped in wealth. Just presence. That's when I understood something I'd missed before. The goal was never to change where we lived. It was to change where we stood. Silence can be powerful. I still believe that. But only when it protects something sacred. Only when it buys time to build, not time to endure. Silence becomes dangerous when it starts shielding injustice. When it teaches the people you love to shrink so others can feel tall. I stayed quiet for years because I thought peace was the highest good. I was wrong. Dignity comes first. Peace built on erasure isn't peace at all. It's maintenance. And maintenance always favors the person already standing comfortably. I don't regret how long I waited. That waiting taught me patience. It taught me restraint. But I'm grateful I didn't wait longer, because there's a moment when silence stops being wisdom and starts being permission. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, ask yourself one question, not out loud, just honestly. How long have you been quiet to keep things easy, while someone you love pays the cost? There's no prize for enduring forever. There's only the quiet knowledge of when it's time to stand up calmly, cleanly, without becoming someone you don't recognize. We didn't win anything. We returned to what we always wanted. A life that fits, a family that stands straight, and the understanding that money is only useful when it knows its place, not in front of people, behind them, holding the structure steady so they don't have to bend.